Well, it's very nice of you all to come on a sunny Sunday afternoon. I'm going to talk about human happiness. It's hard for me to think of a more important or interesting topic than that. I suppose you might make a case for saying that non-human animal happiness or well-being is just as important. I don't mind broadening it in that way. I'll talk especially about what's become known as the economics of happiness, and that's partly concerned, of course, with what the economic foundations might be of human well-being. And I thought it might be, I hoped it might be especially interesting for you to hear about what my hunches are about where this whole literature will go throughout the rest of your lifetime, and more broadly how economics itself as a subject, and that part of social science, might develop and change over the next 3 or 4 or 5 decades of your lives. A key point that I'll come back to on a number of occasions is I think that my kind of economics, and very probably economics generally, is going to become broader and broader and reach out into the hard sciences and in some ways become muddled across the different edges of the disciplines. So I see the economics of happiness merging in with parts of psychiatry and psychology, lots of behavioural science, biology, all sorts of scientific subjects. Occasionally I think about, when I look at the literatures, I think about, imagine one giant wall here is the whole of the social science literature, and it studies humans in a particular way. And imagine the other wall is the hard sciences literature, including the health literature and the biology literature, and that wall studies the same kind of animal, namely humans, in a systematic way. And paradoxically, if you're a representative economics student, you've had virtually no education in how those two walls might come together. Yet both sets of researchers, both walls you might say, are studying the same kind of creature, namely human beings. And I see this part of economics and social science as bringing together those two different ways to think. I'm going to suggest a number of ideas today. I suppose they might be, some of them might be unusual. I hope you find them of interest. I'll talk about fruit and vegetables and hearts, and I'll talk about non-human primates, among other things. And the background idea in all of this talk will be, imagine you take a large random sample of human beings, like the people in this room, and I get all of you to write down a number describing how happy you feel right now, or how happy or satisfied you feel with your life. Then I can look at the patterns in those numbers, and I'm interested in the question, what are the statistical determinants of why you say 6 out of 7, or your neighbour says 7, or the person further over says 1 out of 7. I'd like to understand the economic foundations of your felt well-being, you might say, the forces that mould human happiness in people like us. I'm going to estimate regression equations then. I'm going to look for the underlying patterns. You could think of clouds of data points and lines or planes as being fitted through those clouds of points in ways that probably most people here are familiar with. So I'll treat H, a giant H, as your happiness. This will be a microdata kind of regression equation. I know lots of other things about you, and those data will give me information to put on the right-hand side. So I'd like to know, ceteris paribus, how is your happiness affected by your age and your gender? Women tend to report higher happiness scores in Western countries, other things constant. Your income. Income buys a fair amount of happiness. It appears from the data in Western societies. Education, generally you've done the right thing coming to Warwick University in the literal or figurative sense today, because education, we think, buys a certain amount of extra happiness and mental health, even on top of the extra income that it certainly generates. Place factors are important. There's a very interesting literature developing right now. I saw a new paper yesterday on how your happiness is influenced profoundly by the quality of the air. Even though you can't detect the air quality at all well as an average person, we now know from daily data, for example, from the US and from China, from many other countries, if you chart the SO2 levels, for example, in air quality, then as the level of pollution, even at quite minor levels, goes up and down, people raise or lower their happiness scores in a systematic way. That's after controlling for income and many, many other factors. That's the kind of place factor that seems important for us to know about as humans and as social scientists, and also maybe as policymakers. And if you're a regular economist, or perhaps especially a macroeconomist, you may want to know that we are remarkably shaped by macroeconomic forces in our individual happiness. So as unemployment rises in a Western country, regardless of whether you have a job or not, you become less happy. We assume that's some kind of subconscious fear effect on humans. As the inflation rises, we know this from data, for example, on 500,000 Europeans, as inflation rises in their country, they mark systematically lower on their happiness score sheets, and so on. You get the idea. With these sorts of methods, we can estimate what you might call practical utility functions. You could almost think about this as generating real data on actual indifference curves. If you think about my happiness answers, say from 1 to 7 or 1 to 10, as being like the curves that we usually draw as a quasi-concave utility function. Now, what will our future bring in this area? I thought I would talk about food a bit today. I've got particularly interested in what you could call the social science effects of what we eat. Could you raise your hand if you're a social science student and have ever been taught a lecture about the influence of nutrients or the kinds of foods you eat? Could you raise your hand? One person, maybe two people. Of course, that's representative because I think I'm right in saying that the whole Warwick economics degree never mentions what people eat, except maybe there might be some tiny mention of calories and obesity, but it's essentially nothing on food as nutrients. Yet we are animals who we only run on a single fuel, and that fuel is called food. And in a large part of the hard sciences, think about my wall over here, of course, what I'm taking into my body, you might think very naturally shapes the outcomes. Certainly it does in a whole range of health measures. Yet in social science, we never think about the surely incredibly obvious idea that what we're taking into our bodies surely must, the exact food, must shape. It only makes sense that it's going to shape the social science outcomes. We've been doing a lot of work recently looking at links between happiness and fruit and vegetables, and I advise you to eat a lot of them. In the data, we find that mental well-being on a whole range of measures keeps on rising in representative samples of adults until you get to about 8 different fruits and vegetables a day. I'm afraid I didn't take lunch here, so I'm hoping that the organizer arranged a big selection of fruits and vegetables to keep me cheery. One graph, this is work with my colleague Blanche Flower and Sarah Stewart-Brown, who's a professor at public health at the Warwick Medical School up the hill. And there's one simple picture. This is not psychological health, but it gives you the sense. I thought we'd start with self-reported health on a scale. So none, bottom left, is people who eat no fruit and vegetables. This is random samples from Scotland. And 8 and over, you see, at the right-hand side. This remarkable monotonic relationship, the more fruit and vegetables you eat every day, the better your self-reported health. That carries over after you've adjusted for, let's say, 50 or 100 different other independent variables, including your income, how much meat you eat, many other factors that you would think might be confounding in this correlation. And in our work, we're finding the equivalent effect with your mental well-being and how many fruits and vegetables, the variety that you consume. We published that, we released that, I suppose, 2 months ago. I'm afraid I've forgotten. And a few weeks later, I'm glad to say, a team from the Harvard Public Health Department released another study. We didn't know about it, showing something closely related that I thought was interesting. They released this study showing that if we go into your blood and we measure the concentration of carotenoid, which is an organic substance which you could think of as an antioxidant or linked to antioxidants. It's strongly correlated with the fruit and vegetables that you're eating. These researchers showed there's a strong link between your optimism and how much fruit and vegetable substance, you might say, speaking very, very loosely, is detectable in your blood. An even more interesting study just came out 2 weeks ago from New Zealand. The prime author Tamlin Connor kindly sent me this paper, and this is of people exactly your age. So I'm generalizing here. People about 20 years old. They collected data on 300 New Zealand undergraduates and got them to fill up an exact daily diet. They had to list all their food intakes, and they also measured their happiness every day. They showed, first, controlling for everything, that the wider the variety of fruit and vegetables you had eaten, as it were, you had eaten that day, then the higher the happiness level that you reported. And even more remarkably, the fruit and vegetables that you ate today, that was a predictor of how your mood was 24 hours later. So if you want to be cheerful on Monday, you have to go away this afternoon or this evening and eat lots and lots of fruit and vegetables. Or at least that is what the evidence is consistent with. And scientifically, their paper is considerably better than ours, though we had 100,000 observations eventually, and they've only got a few hundred. But their study has the great advantage they're following the same people. They're taking daily readings on everything they eat and daily readings on their happiness levels. So I think of these two bits of complementary evidence, that this is right up against the frontier of what is known as interesting, and possibly pointing us to the importance for the next 50 years of the mental well-being effects and the social science consequences of the exact foods that we consume. We are humans, so we run on a fuel called food, and yet we forget that in social science. Let me take you to one of the great mysteries of life. You're going to slide down this thing, very probably. There's a great deal of evidence that in the Western world especially, happiness and mental health follow a kind of giant U-shape. The BBC has called this a smile shape, though I somehow think that's not serious enough. In any case, a quadratic equation fits the data well for many, many different countries. We're up to about 70 now, and many, many different measures of mental well-being, including psychiatric health. One shouldn't be too depressed about this, of course, because, for example, the people in the room are starting from a very good happiness base. But holding that constant, it's very likely that you will encounter this U-shape. And this has nothing to do with having young children, or the nature of work, or menopause in women, or anything like that. Because this is true, this quadratic holds strongly in the data across the Western world, even when we factor out all those other things. There's a lot of work going on from people from many different disciplines trying to understand why human well-being is U-shaped through our lives, and that's one paper. Interestingly, Stone is a behavioural scientist, Deaton is a well-known economist at Princeton, and so on. Again, you get the idea of the multidisciplinary teams that are going into this sort of work. This is for about 400,000 randomly sampled Americans. I won't describe the details, but you can see again it's a U-shape through life. The next slide is unusual. Can anybody guess why this slide is unusual? I've shown you the first U-shape was life satisfaction in Great Britain. The second U-shape I showed you was a well-being question, U-shaped through life, for about 400,000 Americans. Any volunteers to suggest what might be unusual about this graph? Yes? It's not in, you're talking about the x-axis? No, it's in age categories, that's perfectly true, but it is getting older, yes, it's blocks of years. Yes? You're absolutely right, but that's not the answer that I'm after. Exactly, there's a big spike around category 5, yes, but that's not the answer either. Sir? Could you say that louder? For a what? A cat? No, it's not for a cat. If I heard you correctly. Any other suggestions? What is unusual? I've shown you the British U-shape. I've shown you the American U-shape. Sir?
Overall happiness when you're younger is higher than when you're older.
That's a perfectly fair point, but that's not what I'm after. No. The answer why this is unusual is this is for great apes. This is for the happiness of chimpanzees and orangutans. We have a sample of 508 great apes in about 65 zoos around the world. The psychological health of these animals is measured by their keepers, and we had the idea a few months ago to look to see whether chimpanzees and apes, great apes, also have U-shaped happiness through their life. Now, I must admit, when we started that project, I didn't think it would work. There are many, many projects as a researcher that you begin that just never go anywhere. That's the nature of the activity. But the first time the data came out, and I saw it on the computer, I was very happy. And we published that paper a few weeks ago in December in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And you can see here for 2 samples of chimpanzees and 1 sample of orangutans, we get U-shaped happiness through life. So it may be that this giant U-shape that you will very probably slide down. The good news is you will then slide up like me. There's some chance that it's driven by physiological factors. We don't know that. But there's going to be a lot of work on that. And one possibility is think about trying to explain that U-shape as a sum of polynomial functions. Clearly, one way to get a U-shape, if you think about it, is to imagine there's one function that goes down and is convex from below, has a positive second derivative. There's another function that's going up, part of happiness, which is convex from below. It's also got a positive second derivative. And overall well-being is a mixture of those two. That's the simplest way. But you might want to think about this as a mixture of many different kinds of polynomials underlying overall well-being in your life. And the Stone paper begins, although they didn't think of it that way, to get at some of that. If you ask Americans, a random sample of Americans about anger, then you get the bottom left diagram saying that older people report steadily lower levels of anger as they age. And in case you're suspicious of all happiness data, say you'd be entitled to be that, but I wouldn't advise it, then the same sort of U-shape, for example, shows up in antidepressant use, if you prefer a literal measure of something correlated with unhappiness. Let me say a few more things and then stop and throw the floor open. I think that economics is going to blend more and more with biological science in ways that probably are not very familiar to you if you're doing the average kind of economics course. If you put me under pressure, you will find that my blood pressure rises and my heart rate rises. If you put me under strain. Of course, that's because after millions of years of evolution, it's rational because of the fight or flight response. When you stress the animal knows it either has to run away or fight. And in both cases, it's sensible automatically for the biological system to be boosted in that way. In principle, I could imagine a world towards the end of your lifetime where the BBC News doesn't announce the GDP figures, possibly not even the unemployment figures, but rather announces a happiness index, presumably with a roll of music typical of the BBC, a happiness index that's partly biological, maybe measuring the average heart rate in England as a measure of underlying stress, for example. Maybe blood pressure as one element of the overall well-being index on the BBC News in 2060, and so on. Those things sound far-fetched in 2013, but it would have been insane 100 or 200 years ago if somebody had said the BBC News or the equivalent will carry GDP or unemployment figures. Along the way, we're going to have to cope if we do start taking bioscientific measures as part of our criteria for human well-being in the social sciences. We're going to have to cope with some unusual notions. It's widely thought that stressed people have high blood pressure. You've probably heard this. Most middle-aged people worry about this. Many, many doctors say if they have a patient who's got high blood pressure, oh, you have to relax more, you're under too much stress. Unfortunately, when you look at the data, that's completely wrong. Okay, that is completely wrong. If you take a random sample of, say, the British population, there's an inverse relationship, exactly the opposite from what is commonly believed. One way to measure stress is to use a GHQ score. I'll give you the exact questions, the underlying questions, in a minute, but it's a measure of psychiatric strain, you might say. And if we take about 100,000 people, 66,000 in this particular sample to be precise, and you measure their systolic blood pressure, and that's the top number. If you go to your GP and get your blood pressure measured, it might be 130/60. 130 is the top number. And what you find is, in random samples of British people, the high blood pressure folk have the lowest levels of mental strain. Exactly the opposite of what I suppose most citizens in Great Britain are taught. Exactly the opposite. Here are the kinds of questions that are used to measure mental strain on that criterion, and if we take out just the data on felt constantly under strain, that behaves in exactly the same way. We don't understand that, and I won't give you the possible theories today, if you'll forgive me, but we have a lot to learn. Partly what lies behind interest in the so-called economics of happiness is this Stiglitz report. Something called the Stiglitz Commission was set up by Sarkozy in France. I was one of the people on that. There were a bunch of us from around the world, and I suppose the remit was, if you're going to think about designing for the whole of your lifetime, your generation's lifetime, what is the right welfare maximand? What should be the objective of government? And we're going to move away from simply counting up the number of euros or pounds sterling as the criterion for success. What should we have as that optimal maximand? What should we be trying to maximize? What should we care about in Western society? And you can see from this clip that the Commission thought that in part we should be measuring how much people say they're enjoying their lives. This is how the report was greeted by some of the press. Le Monde translated it as happiness is the new GDP. Happiness is the new GDP. It's very likely, though not certain, that that way of thinking will dominate throughout your life. Not certain, but likely. Let me close with a few points. I'm delighted to take any questions from you or listen to your arguments. I like to think that happiness data, I'm using the word loosely, it could include mental health data, satisfaction data, many kinds of biological measures of happiness as well. In principle, they give us proxy utility data. And if that's the case, then we can do economics in a much more direct way than probably you have been taught is possible. I'm not saying that is free of error, but it's a remarkable thing that really our whole profession is concerned with understanding and improving human happiness, and yet virtually no attention has been paid historically to trying to measure that. That's a remarkable fact. Second, I see a broadening, a sort of blending, I suppose, between economics and many other kinds of disciplines. I see us moving from publishing in the American Economic Review to publishing in the traditional hard sciences journals, and that's starting to happen. If you've heard of a man called James Heckman, and if you have done some econometrics, you probably have. 3 weeks ago, Heckman published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. Does anybody know on what? He published it on chimpanzees, on what happens in chimpanzees' lives if there's random assignment, possibly not, this is possibly not desirable, random assignment of children to different chimpanzee parents. He's interested in figuring out how childhood shapes our human lives. So that's just one example. A man called Ernst Fehr in Zurich is leading the world among economists, studying oxytocin, for example, studying various kinds of physiological systems and how those matter in the social science world. I think biomarker data, looking inside your body, measuring your heart rate, going inside your skull in a very, very nice, gentle way to measure your brain waves and so on, such approaches will become possibly not dominant, but certainly important in the subject of economics throughout your life. And these are my conclusions. Remember your fruit and vegetables tonight. If you get an option, I'm afraid I don't know how it works here. Remember the variety of fruit and vegetables. There's fairly good evidence, though not clinching evidence yet, that a wide variety will boost your happiness and mental health. And of course, traditionally, it's been known that doing so is helpful to ward off cancer and heart disease. One day, economists are going to start to study apes and humans within the same paper. We're very close to that. I haven't done that literally. Heckman hasn't done that literally, but I can see that's the next step. I see the human heart, blood pressure and heart rate and so on being used as direct data into the welfare maximans used, say, by the Bank of England. That would be a shock, wouldn't it? The Bank of England measures people's heart rates and then decides how much quantitative easing. You may think that's utterly mad, but look me up in 50 years and we'll see what happens. And more broadly, I think welfare maximans are going to change in our kind of discipline. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Oswald, for that. We've got plenty of time for questions, so can we have hands up, please? Yep. So if we go from the end and then we can work our way in that row there. If we can get a microphone to just like that, if you could put your hands up again. Thanks. And then pass it down to the lady in the middle.
Hello, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. And I have a question regarding the feasibility of using happiness to trying to improve overall human happiness.
Yes.
Because if we look at the Easterlin Paradox, for example, and other examples, there are quite a few points of evidence that humans have reference-dependent utility. So I think improving reference for improving utility for everyone could be rather challenging.
Yes. I think you make a very important point. Let me just say, in case some people here don't know what the Easterlin Paradox is, named after a man called Richard Easterlin, still going strong in California in his 80s, still publishing 2 or 3 papers a year. And the Easterlin Paradox says, if you look over long periods of time, of course, countries get much, much richer, decade after decade. But happiness surveys run flat as an approximation. So it appears that all that economic growth that we have in the West is not buying any extra happiness. And indeed, in his latest paper, Easterlin showed that China, despite 10% annual growth rates for the longest period ever seen in human history, China has actually got slightly less happy than it was 20 years ago. And the background point, if I understand you, is that probably I evaluate my own happiness, if only subconsciously, by comparing my income to how much those other wretched economics professors in the Department of Economics at Warwick earn. And unfortunately, growth lifts all our incomes together. So I get a Porsche and they get a Porsche. And that neutralizes, at least so goes the argument, that might neutralize happiness. That's one interpretation of the Easterlin Paradox. I don't think it applies to every sphere of human life, this reference dependence, this harsh neutrality, you might say. But it certainly does seem to apply to everything to do with income in your lives. And we know that if you put 2 people side by side in fMRI scanners, this was done by Armin Falk and others in Bonn, and you change the rewards that the 2 people in these scanners are getting within the lab, you can see the reward areas of the brain register disapproval when the other guy gets more money in that fMRI scanner. So you can literally see what you might call envy, Schadenfreude, I suppose, they called it in Bonn. You can literally see that in the brain. So this reference dependence is real, but we'll have to hope, if we want to make society happier, that it doesn't exist in every sphere, that we're not stuck in some giant Easterlinian paradox. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
Over the past 2 decades, we've been witnessing a transition from quantitative measures, mainly GDP per capita type of indexes, towards qualitative measures, such as the United Nations Human Development Index.
Okay.
If we look at the countries that rank highest, mainly Scandinavian countries like Norway or Sweden or Denmark, with more than 0.93 or 0.95 on the Human Development Scale, we also witness that government policies on education and healthcare have played the major role or the driving force to actually lead to this type of result. Where do you see the role of government intervention policies?
Yes.
Bearing in mind that, for example, in Denmark, the tax on fat or produce that contain high levels of sugar or fat ingredients has actually been abandoned after a year since it's been introduced. Is that sustainable on the long term? Thank you.
Right. Well, you're getting at some fantastically important and interesting issues there, aren't you? I'm not sure I'd call the HDI, the Human Development Index, qualitative. I mean, in fact, it's a mixture of a convex combination of things like lifespan and so on. But I can see it's not straightforwardly quantitative in quite the same way as GDP. We honestly don't know how important the public policy regime is in the Scandinavian countries. Now, those countries, there's a widespread view in those nations that their strong welfare state helps them be high up a happiness league table. And there is a bit of evidence consistent with that in the literature, but we don't have overwhelming evidence that that's true. It could be something else to do with those nations. About the only thing that I think we have proved conclusively on that is that in panel data we know, that is following countries through time, we know that as you raise the level of unemployment benefit, the social security level, you might say loosely, then countries get happier, ceteris paribus. But exactly how social institutions, the welfare state and so on, might shape human happiness, we don't know. The fact that the happy nations tend to be the West European welfare state nations must count as important anecdotal, intuitive evidence, but that's a long way from real empirical proof.
Thank you.
So that's what I'd say. Most Americans would argue that their nation does pretty well in happiness league tables because they're not welfare state. So there's a lot of conflict out there.
Okay, we have a question down the front here, if you get the microphone.
Thank you. If in the future people start basing policies on, brain scans and all factors you talk about, do you think there could be, a moral dispute over this, that it's invasive to?
Well, if I was literally putting electrodes into your brain and it was hurting you, then yes, that would cause a lot of moral trouble, wouldn't it? I'm just assuming that you could imagine surveys taken where people are beeped intermittently. We have these electronic beepers where they have to write down how happy are you feeling right now. You could imagine we get a sample of our citizens to wear non-painful wrist ringlets, or I don't know what you would call them, measuring the blood pressure and the heart rate and so on. I envisage a world where, it may sound strange, that's what gets collected. That wouldn't be invasive in a harmful way, would it?
It's just that, what distinguishes us as human objects as opposed to animals is that we, there's supposed to be a respect for us that, as another human being, you can't know what's going on inside the mind of other human beings. Therefore, you don't have the right to take it as an animal and observe it scientifically and abuse it.
I imagine there are some strong views on that in the room.
Okay.
You've seen that I might well make the claim that there's not much difference between humans and apes, right? I mean, certainly if I look forward to this kind of world, the BBC News in 50 years from now, I can imagine there will be ethical issues to be confronted. But we're already measuring people's incomes, we're measuring their health, and I don't think, as long as we don't hurt them and we're collecting important information, wouldn't that be okay morally? That's what I think. And by and large, I suppose I don't put humans necessarily much higher than other non-human animals, or at least some of the non-human animals, but that would be a bigger debate. Is that an answer?
Thank you.
Okay.
We've got a question there.
Thank you for your talk.
Hi, where are you? Sorry. Yes, forgive me. Yes.
I was wondering, like, how do you? I'm a bit concerned about how you define basically happiness. What is happiness? Because I would assume that there is within this room, as you started your talk with like if we number our happiness from 1 till 10. I would bet if you did that and then asked like what makes you happy, that we would get dozens of different answers. My happiness, what I define as happiness, might as well be something completely different, like other priorities for other people in the room.
Yes. Okay.
And I can imagine that culture plays a big role. You know, like maybe in Scandinavia they value certain things in life higher than maybe they do in Southern Europe or something. So I'm concerned about like how do you define happiness if you want to use it as a method of evaluating,
right?
Like, replacing it with the GDP, basically.
Okay. Of course, that's a natural and important scientific question. When you're happy, if I may ask, would you say that you know when you're happy? If I asked you.
No, like I guess. Not all the time, by far not all the time, sometimes.
Okay. We work on the assumption in this research that, roughly speaking, people know themselves, and they know when they're feeling happy and they know when they're feeling fed up. So we just take their responses literally, as those individuals are the best judge. Now, of course, it's quite true that if I give you a scale, say from 1 to 10, or 1 to 7 is often used, then you might give me a happiness reading that's 6, whereas your neighbour is equally happy and might give me a 5. And that would be a problem in principle. We've got various ways of getting around that. I mean, one is just to average across lots of people and hope that these errors net out. But a more sophisticated way is to follow a random sample of people through time. And because we see them again and again, we know what their underlying baseline level is. We know the people who will essentially start from 5. And then we're tracking changes, rises or falls, as life events hit them from the underlying base. And that's liable to be a lot more reliable. But, of course, whenever we're attempting to measure human feelings and human happiness, there's always going to be some issue of the kind that you rightly described. We're getting at what you could call is the most interesting and complex emotion. So we're always going to measure it with some error. I just don't think there's any alternative sensibly in public policy or social science than attempting as best we can to measure it. That would be my answer.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. If we go to the gentleman at the back there.
Hi, I was just wondering whether, like, how relevant your data would be for, like, developmental policies, especially towards, like, for, like, the IMF and the World Bank for third world poverty and stuff like that, especially since Stiglitz was from the World Bank, if I'm not wrong, right? Okay.
I missed the last little bit, but you're asking me how relevant are these ideas for developing countries?
Yeah.
Yes. I think they are relevant. The Easterlin Paradox, the fact that countries get much richer through time and their happiness numbers don't rise. Indeed, on some measures, mental health is getting slightly worse through time in Britain. I think that's more important for the rich countries than the poorer nations. In other words, if most African countries ask me for advice, which none has done so far, about being happier, then my instinct is they do need more real income. So in developing countries, my instinct is that income matters more, extra income matters more than in the already wealthy countries, where I do believe in the Easterland Paradox. But a lot of the other stuff is rather generic. If you look at the structure of a happiness equation, I could show you regression equations from a developing country and a very rich country without telling you which was which. And just by looking at the coefficients on marriage and aging and all of that, you would have a lot of trouble knowing which data set was the rich country and which was the poor. So I'd like to think we're uncovering very powerful patterns inside human beings, But the role of income, I think, is more important in developing countries, and my instinct is, and what some of the data that we have, my instinct is that they do need more growth. It's just that we've got all the BMWs we need, really, and the poorer countries they're still short of many of the basics.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Oswald. Can we thank him again?